wait a minute, if this building needs about a 6-foot wall here, and that will make this building safe, what about everything around you? Like if the sea level gets to that level of height, like everything around you is all flooded. And at that point, does everyone need to buy a boat?
Just get DoorDash to come to you with a canoe.
Yeah, but if we're at, I mean, it may be the reality. It may be a near reality that we all need to face and be comfortable with. So that's scary.
Welcome to another in between season episode of the Most Modern Podcast. In this episode, we are talking about sustainability and resiliency in cities and how different strategies cities are using to deal with the incoming climate change that is going to impact how we all live. Our next season is going to be on sustainability, so we thought a few of these deep dives would be interesting as a tee up to the next season.
Yeah, let's start with sea level rise.
Yeah, guys, it's increasingly become important. I think I've been traveling a little bit. I'm in Hong Kong right now. I was just in Copenhagen. You notice more and more a lot of building happening along the waterfront. I think cities are waking up to the fact that the coastline is changing, and that also a lot of investment has already been put into buildings around the coastline, and therefore they need to be protected. So I think it's a great topic to start discussing how some of these ramifications play out. What do you guys see in terms of what's happening around where you are, especially in New York, Boston, in terms of how sea level rise is being addressed in the built environment?
Well, for Boston's case, I see interactive maps and some, nice renderings, new plans for new kind of parks or remediation efforts, berms and stuff. Boston is an old city, and an old city is built around water. And all the dense office buildings are along the water. And those will be the first parts that will get impacted by water. But I don't know what's going to happen. We all know that the sea level will rise about a foot in 2050. But I guess we're still trying to figure out what to do when that happens.
Well, it's such a slow process, right? 2050, we'll be how old by then? And a foot doesn't seem like that much. But when you think about it on the scale of the entire globe, it really is. And yeah, like you said, Boston is it's such a water city. I mean, if you look at the old maps of Boston, it was basically an island first and then has slowly been filled out, mostly with landfill, actually, like a lot of harbor cities. I mean, Lebo, you're in New York. You have the Big U there. You have other initiatives. Do you feel an impact on your day-to-day life?
I think whenever it rains too heavily and the subway's flooded, I think everyone gets a little feeling that things are coming. Ooh. I think you constantly hear about the MTA's battle with floodwaters and incoming change, but I think you also see it a lot in the Big U is a big project, but I think if you look at a lot of the waterfront projects, there are resiliency measures kind of built in. A lot of the waterfront parks are elevated. They have little marshes and things that are kind of built in to counteract some of these storms and floods. I think Hurricane Sandy was probably an inflection point for the city. At least here in Lion City locally, I know that a lot of apartment buildings got FEMA money to elevate things like their generators, their boilers, things like that, just so if something happens again, the impact won't be as bad. But I think you can probably see it both on an urban scale, where the city is coming in and doing these large projects, but also on a local scale where these multifamily units are going to need to protect themselves in a way, or stand the risk of, I guess, losing all their renters or no their owners.
Man, that's scary.
Yeah, I was there during Sandy. It was not fun. We had just graduated from college and started working in New York, and 2 months in, the whole city shuts down basically. And I think that that was a watershed moment, no pun intended, where people really started to realize, especially of a certain generation, that this is not necessarily going to be a once in a lifetime thing. This might happen again. And the disruption it caused was really incredible. Just the sort of heartache that it caused to put people out. We had to move our office, and I was sleeping on my friend's couch basically. It was very strange, and especially to happen in a place like New York, which is supposed to be always functioning 24/7 city. to see the sort of downstream consequences 10 years later is quite interesting, because on one hand, I think there are a lot of initiatives. Every city, especially waterfront cities, has some kind of plan. At the same time, the physical and kind of noticeable ramifications of those things aren't as drastic as one might have expected right after Sandy. Like we see renderings from the big U of these like aquariums where you can see whales swimming as the sea level rises. I think it's quite interesting.
But I think it's two-part, right? Like one, like these things affect cities more, right? Cities are more likely to be coastal, and by nature they're going to be more affected. But I think the second part also is like by being more dense and having more people, it's much harder to rally everyone around to do some of these big things that are necessary. I guess even for New York, right? Like probably the best thing is for everyone to move a little bit inland, but you're probably not going to get that to happen.
Yeah, you're on one of two islands if you live in New York, basically, or 3 islands.
Yeah, I thought all the tall pencil towers were there for that reason.
Well, it is an interesting point because
be the first one who are screwed.
But yeah, generally speaking, the ones who are most affected are the ones who are closest to the water, not necessarily the ones who are living in the penthouse. No, but I think it's an interesting point, Lebo. Like most cities grew out of economic development that was stimulated by some connection to the water because of trade. New York is a great example, Boston as well, San Francisco, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, London, all these places. And so that asset has now become a little bit of a liability and is increasingly becoming more liable as time progresses. So what sort of things can be done to address it, I think is really important. One thing that's starting to emerge is the fact that people like to be near the water. And so that those areas that were previously used for industrial capacity are now being used for activity, leisure, for fun and entertainment. And so those spaces can be sort of more flexible. I'm thinking specifically.
My question is it a design question or a policy question, or probably both? And the fact that each buildings, they can be designed in a way that they have, prevention. It can be programmatic proposals where you have a larger podium, or there can be many stuff that can be strategized in a property. But like, is it even useful if all your streets around you are flooded? Like, would it work in that case? And what happens if the building itself is not dense enough to even make all those like fancy basketball courts? They don't have the money to build them. Like, what happens then?
You can imagine the Venicification of a lot of American cities or European cities, where we move around on water a lot more. There's this great, well, it's not a good movie. I forget what it's called. It's about Miami. It's got Hugh Jackman. It came out during the pandemic, where they basically show Miami completely flooded. And the movie's not that great, but the images are really stimulating. And you can imagine that. But I do think it's a bit of a design and a policy question. And it seems to be like the motivating factor, like a lot of things, is actually economic sustainability and development. If the cities are flooded, who's going to do business there? If no one's doing business, who's going to live? Who's going to work? How are you going to get tax revenue? Then the city atrophies and dies. I think that seems to be the motivating factor. And as we talked to, for instance, some of our conversations on the upcoming season, we realized that resiliency is not just about the physical environment. It's mostly about making sure that people can live, work, and play in a certain place, and that sort of economic activity continues to thrive.
So just in simple terms, would you buy something near the water now? Basically, I'm asking, are you more optimistic that the city will come with some sort of strategy to prevent any property value losses? Or would you just not buy and not touch anything on the waterfront? Because that's also quite difficult.
Well, you have to be able to afford something on the waterfront first.
That's true.
Although you're getting, there's more and more sales these days, right? Like we're seeing, we're noticing properties going down value because of their proximity to water. So,
yeah, for sure. Like I'm in the market I'm looking for a place to buy a tiny place for myself and Sue. But we were looking at this apartment on Boston waterfront designed by A.M. Pei on India Row. It's a twin tower apartment. I think it's like 20 stories tall. It's a very well designed building, and I've seen a lot of units getting poured into the market. And I actually went for a tour because it was a building that's very charming. It has a very decent lobby, a swimming pool. Like it's right in the middle. It's right in the center. It's very well connected and all that. But what I've heard is that a lot of unit owners are selling their units because there is a reassessment of the property, meaning that they have reassessed their lobby situation and the fact that they're so close to the water that the property management company realized the need of a quick fix and upper. So basically, they're trying to enlarge their lobby space, capture part of the outdoor space, and then try to build a wall there. And that cost, because it is a condo, is shared among all of the unit owners, and that's estimated around $50,000 to $60,000 per unit. And that alone, I think, kind of spooked everyone. So suddenly you see like 20, 30 units out in the market with quite some discounts, I must say.
Yeah, that's not
So I
just
was looking
fixing
into
some
it-
windows.
That's why I'm
equivalent
asking.
to the
Yeah,
amount?
that's why I'm asking. Is it worth the bet? Would you do it?
Wait, what were you saying, Libo?
But I guess is the discount equivalent to the amount that they would have to spend, right? Like, are you getting a 60K discount?
Well, the owners that I talked to, they were actually offering to give you that assessment money on top, or to take it out from the sales price. So it's really not about the assessment value. I think it's the fact that they're doing something to prevent water coming into the building, but I think the owners are not convinced that will be enough.
Yeah, this seems
Because,
like it's a different
a lot of
case
their
than just.
amenities. Yeah.
This isn't just fixing a window or changing light bulbs or repainting the lobby. This is a wholesale kind of offensive kind of positioning of the entire building, which is, I think, psychologically is very different from standard sort of renovations that condos have to go through. Even when I compare it to seismic retrofits, which one can say, okay, as long as I do this, we're pretty good. Like we're dealing with, in terms of especially sea level rise, a situation which is uncontrollable at a certain point. And flooding is really difficult to manage. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I would say that the question becomes like, what is your appetite for that sort of risk? And if I'm looking at anything, first of all, you always have to look to your due diligence. This is if you're buying into property for yourself or you're working on a project, always look at the flood of the flood maps. I think we've been doing that. Our generation has been doing that for a long time. And understand the risk, right? Like you have to underwrite it yourself. But I do think that there are increasingly more and more risks, and one's appetite for that risk changes depending on your position in life. So it makes total sense, Miku, what you're saying. There are people who want to get out, basically. Maybe it's a good opportunity for those who want to get in. Who knows?
Well, I'm a lover of a waterfront, so that's why I'm debating.
There's still great advantages to being on the waterfront, right? Like you have a beautiful view, you have access to that water. You probably don't have a lot of neighbors around you. So I think there are good qualities as well. It's just, is it worth it at the end of the day?
Yeah, it's
hard to say.
Yeah, exactly. So one part of my mind is trying to convince myself, like, but it's a great property. Like IMP designed it, and it has a great lobby. It's like covered with full travertine. Where can you find that type of building in Boston?
But I think the other thing you have to consider is like your confidence in the management, right? Like it's almost like a microcosm where if you own a condo, you're a part owner of this building, you make decisions together. And as we've talked about in other episodes, arriving at consensus is not necessarily the easiest thing. So even if you think that there is some great solution that you can implement to make everyone's lives better, you have to, play the politics of the condo board to get something like that in place.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's almost like a small city in that sense.
So, like I said, I'm almost trying to convince myself to buy in it, but the biggest factor that stops me from doing it is because, wait a minute, if this building needs about a 6-foot wall here and that will make this building safe, what about everything around you? Like if the sea level gets to that level of height, like everything around you is all flooded. And at that point, does it even mean, and does building alone even mean anything? Like, how are you going to transport and go to places from that isolated building? Like, does everyone need to buy a boat?
Just get
So I
DoorDash
think,
to come to you with a canoe.
yeah. But if we're at, I mean, it may be the reality. It may be a near reality that we all need to face and be comfortable with. So that's scary. Or maybe the way that I need to do is like think about what the future waterfront is and maybe buy a place there.
Look, I think there's a couple ways of thinking about it. One is that there's the sort of Venice situation where everything is flooded and we move around by paddle boat and we're always wearing rubber boots. I think the other way of thinking about this is also that other people will adapt too and lifestyles will change. So it is an interesting question, Minku, because you're basically boiling down in your own financial decision about if you want to go into this building or not, sort of boiling down what is your vision for the future? Is that lifestyle
Exactly.
something that's going to exist? Is it something you want to be a part of? Is it something other people are going to be a part of?
It even comes down to your faith of humanity. Like, would we survive as a community, as a waterfront community? Can we survive? Will there be a way? I don't know.
Well, I think on that topic,
I'm getting
one thing I would think about, to be honest, is have those communities done it before? And so, we were talking off camera about the Netherlands and Denmark and how they've been living with the water for hundreds of years, and now they're sort of the experts in dealing with it. And that, anytime there's a question about waterfront resiliency, you got to go to the Dutch. I think in the American context, it's something rather new that we're dealing with. But other cities and other places have been getting wetter and wetter for a long period of time. And so the question becomes not necessarily, do you want to deal with it? I think it's, like you said, can that community face this issue? And I think that, for instance, my experience working in New Jersey on the Rebuild by Design, which was a bunch of money that the Department of Housing and Urban Development brought in after Hurricane Sandy to address some of these sea level rise concerns, was an interesting case in how people think about this. It's not anything anyone wants to think about at all. First of all, it's that sort of inconvenient truth that Al Gore talked about. But and people have different perspectives on it because it has to do with your lifestyle. So people with waterfront properties of Manhattan, in this case, they didn't want a big 6-foot wall in front of them. They said, I bought this view. I don't want that blocked. At the same time, you present them with the situation where, hey, look, you might be underwater. Is that really worth it at the end of the day? And then they start to think about it. But this all happens, at least in New Jersey, in a very public setting where people are talking at these public meetings, even going to Twitter and talking about it, causing a ruckus sometimes. So I think that it would test our ability to cooperate in a way that maybe has never happened before. You can't really pick a side. Mm-hmm. You have to sort of, you either deal with it or you don't. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that was a fascinating. It started as a design competition, right? Like HUD invited several designers, famous architects, and OMA was included. It was Bjarke Engel's group. And then I think there was one more or two more.
There are quite a few. So what happened was there's a bunch of sites around the New York metro area that were addressed to have this money distributed to them. So like Hoboken, Lower Manhattan, parts of Long Island, Meadowlands, all these different places.
Yeah. I'm curious, what was the design strategies? Going back to the point of, is this a design question or a policy question? Like, what was the response of the architects, or at least from OMA?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought process as I break it down. So I forget the exact number. For Hoboken, I think they allocated $230 million. And so across the entire metro areas, in the kind of factor of billions, maybe a couple billion total. So they allocate the money and they say, what can we do with this money? And so I think I was involved in the later phases. I wasn't involved in the competition phase for the project, but the competition basically established a set of principles or strategy for how to deal with it. So each competition team put forward a proposal, and this is very schematic level. So the strategy that the OMA team presented was called resist, delay, store, discharge. So basically, a sequence of events that would allow for you to accommodate a flood event. It was very schematic. It was very strategic at the time. I think there was some input from engineers and from the city, but it was more notional. So once that was awarded and got the money, then you actually have to kick into gear and get things done. And at that point, OMA actually was no longer the prime on the project. They became a consultant to an engineering firm that was actually going to implement this stuff, because then you start to encounter all the sort of requirements from the city, from the state, from the federal government, from the Army Corps of Engineers, the actual engineering that would allow for you to resist, delay, store, discharge, etc. And it was quite interesting because I felt like at that moment the design really took a backseat, but I could also understand why. Like, you're not going to worry about what something looks like in the event of a flood, but you're going to worry about how something performs. And at the end of the day, the liability is on the performance, the engineering performance of the measure, not necessarily on the aesthetic qualities. That being said, I think that we could have really integrated and done a much better job working together, both from the engineers working with us and us working with the engineers. But the situation is not the situation is not set up to really forefront design because we just don't have the expertise at the end of the day.
This was about 10 years ago, like around 2015, right? And I would imagine almost 10 years have passed. Something, because I knew about this competition and this initiative, and I imagined by this time now, like something might have started, like construction, because it's almost 10 years now. Like, do you know what's happening?
Yeah, so the work that I was on resulted in an EIR, an environmental impact report, which is kind of the first step in order to actually implement things. So they need to really assess kind of what happened. So that's the thing about America. Everything takes a while because there are a lot of processes that one has to go through. So it's good that you do the work early. You don't want to do that too late. But I would also say that not everybody agrees that this is happening. Like I said, you have people on the waterfront who have $1 million properties of their homes, from their homes looking towards Manhattan. And these interviews are out there. There's a huge backlash towards the work because it's literally a 6-foot barrier. And, you put glass, maybe you can see through, but that's a lot more expensive. Maybe make a platform that people go up onto and look forward. But it's going to change the landscape of the city. And as we have talked about before, people are pretty hesitant to that sort of change, especially when it's as drastic as a wall. So we try to avoid using that term in any capacity. We try to use things like barriers or design options. But I remember this interview with this lady. She said, well, look, we're in the 100-year floodplain. We already had Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So my she's 15. So if she lives to 100, she won't even see another one. Something like that. I mean, people don't really understand what the 100-year floodplain means. It's not necessarily that I guarantee you it's only going to happen once every 100 years. It means you have a 1% chance every year of this happening. So it could happen 5 years in a row. It would be a small chance, but it could still happen. So people don't actually agree about these things. And especially when they have their own interests involved, especially when they have their own financial interests or their property values, for instance. So it is really a tricky subject. And I think the key, to be honest, is being able to, in whatever authority one has, is being able to understand these different perspectives. So, why do people want their city to continue to look the same way, or why would they want it to change? Why would they not want it to change, for instance? Those sort of questions I think are really critical.
In this example, right? Like, the design competition happened 10 years ago, right? Even, we saw a lot of media about it. Like, almost none of it is starting to get built. Like, how much do you think the design competition and the resulting kind of design was much more about marketing and kind of popularizing the idea of something needing to be done, rather than, say, like a direct to project thing where it was absolutely going to get built?
Yeah, I think it's a good question about design competitions in general. These are ideas. They're not necessarily thought out, engineered products. And so on one hand, I think it's critical to have that sort of galvanizing energy that comes along with nice images, renderings, diagrams, presentations, like get people talking about these things, because no one's going to read a report and say, oh my God, we got to do this. But if you see a cool image on Instagram, you might say, wait, you might lobby your local representative, or you might start talking about it amongst your friends and say, hey, this is pretty cool, let's do that. at the same time, you guys all know that you can draw anything. Like, it doesn't really mean anything at the end of the day. It's really about taking that idea and starting to develop it and turn it into something feasible and constructible that really matters. And I think that's the hard part. There's just a lot of effort and energy that goes into that maybe isn't the most efficient process. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, you don't want to overpromise, but at the same time, you don't want to undersell. This was an initiative that was proposed by the federal government. And I think what's interesting, and this is sort of how these sort of projects work, is that the federal government is giving the money, but they're giving the responsibility to the state and the local government to allocate and actually use the money. So that's, again, if the state and the local government doesn't get their process through, doesn't do the work that they need to do, they don't get the money. So this isn't, at the end of the day, being seen as a gift to the local government. Of course, the federal government has interest in places like New York and New Jersey, for just the well-being of the American economy and sort of society. But yeah, it was all federal money, I think, all from HUD. And yeah, so there was a lot of kind of galvanizing pressure on making sure that we got the money and got it worked out. But there's a ton of inefficiency there. And I'm not saying this happened on this project, but there's a lot of worry about corruption, for instance, that projects are going to people, because these are big contracts, that the money is going to people not necessarily for the sake of merit or for qualifications, but because they're friends with so and so, or they want some sort of political kickback. So there is a good reason there for why you would also need to have a good vetting process, and why you would need to move a little bit slowly. You don't want to go too fast. So it's just very complicated. And I think it's a larger issue if we're talking about sea level rise in America or in general. Like, we're talking about big projects, and this isn't like just building a single building or building a park. These are big, complex projects that, as you're mentioning, Libo, you have money coming from various sources, being spent by various sources. And I think there are certain countries that have actually proven themselves to be better at dealing with big projects. I wouldn't say America or a lot of Western countries are actually at the top there. Maybe it has to do with the sort of dispersed and democratic sort of, situation we have here.
Yeah. Well, speaking of big projects, Rotterdam has its largest port in the Europe, and also to protect that, they have this largest movable structure in the world called the Maaslands Barrier. So it's basically I'm overly simplifying, of course, but it's basically two massive doors that are about 690 feet wide and 72 feet tall, that opens and closes. And when there's anything, when a storm hits, when the storm water gets like 5 meters above the usual sea level, then the door starts to open. They contain the water and they close. So maybe like these type of massive infrastructural projects maybe that could be another way to respond to sea level rise, not just building walls for individual properties, but like try to find the source of this flow of water and try to have a massive tank there. What was the experience? I mean, you guys probably have more knowledge in the U.S. market. Were there anything similar to this size of an infrastructural project being done?
Probably like the
Yeah.
New Orleans, like the New Orleans levees were pretty. I imagine a pretty sizable project. At least like when we went to school, the Houston Bayous, that was a pretty big kind of infrastructure project. I think part of the difference also is like, I think if you look at a country like the Netherlands, it's a lot smaller. It's a lot less diverse. Just by nature, less diverse places are easier for people to come to consensus for God knows what reason. But also, I think, the States is a unique situation where there is a separation of the federal and state government. And I think if you just look at the trouble New York has with the transportation between across the Hudson, right, you kind of get a little bit of an insight over just what doing something across state lines, even in the same metropolitan area, can produce enormous difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think my understanding is that the more complex a situation is, so talking about the context, like Libo's discussing, so the political or the economic context, the more people try to go for just sort of straightforward and simple solutions. So non-kinetic, meaning walls and barriers. But Libo does bring up an interesting point too, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a single wall that protrudes from the ground. It could also be an area that's spread out over a vast region that would allow for some sort of storage or retention before you reach flooding. And I think Houston is a prime example. I mean, that city is not dense at all, and it's kind of known for that. So it's going to play to its strengths and say, well, why don't we actually build up this park infrastructure, these bayous, and start to make sure that those are the places that are accommodate for any sort of surge that we're going to get. And I know that there's a lot of effort and a lot of initiative there. And in fact, a lot of federal funding when it comes to research, NIH type stuff, is looking at this sort of thing. So how do you accommodate, let's say, urbanization in a flood zone? Or how do you deal with sort of managed retreat? How do you deal with allowing for these things to happen, but in a way that actually protects people?
Yeah, and Houston, I think, is a really interesting case study too, where there are policies that contribute to kind of this distributed manner that resiliency is built out. I think in Houston, if you build something of a certain size, you're required to have like a certain percentage for retention. So if you like build a stadium, you have like X square feet of parking, you need to build enough retention in order to hold all that runoff water. And that's just kind of like a building requirement that it's not necessarily the city building this giant retention pond in the middle of the city, but it's something that's like much more distributed. I think when we were going to school there, I think we did a studio on the watershed that one of the engineers we were talking to said that if every house was able to detain like 2 inches of water, like Houston's flood problems would be pretty much mitigated. Right. So when you do have that mass, when you do have that scale, the solution might be very small and very incremental and potentially not as bothersome as, say, like a 6-foot wall in front of your house.
Yeah. So you get this trade off where you either do the one big thing, like all at once, or you work more incrementally and at a smaller scale. But then the challenge becomes creating that consensus and that buy-in that you don't have one authorizing agency that's going to do one thing by itself.
Well, I don't think we're at a point where we can choose this or that. I think it will probably require doing everything, because I read an article that talked about the real risk of sea level rise. We only think that it's the borders and the shorelines, but it's actually not. It's the overall water table itself. So like groundwater, for instance, if the sea level rises, the groundwater level also rises, and your basements and your buildings are designed to handle a specific pressure of water, but that becomes an issue because then the water's pushing the building up now. So there's a huge risk in like basements, and especially if there are buildings who have like HVAC systems in the basements, which is quite typical in older construction, then that becomes a real risk. So I think we're talking about we're at a point that we need to do everything full steam ahead in all aspects, not just the waterfronts. So I'm curious if there are any incentives out there already from like different states or cities that gives out for any losses for like individual property owners, because I have yet to see it happen in Boston. Like, we're not talking about private property yet.
I mean, I think incentives is an interesting point, right? Like your example, Minku, of the building, right? There is, even though it's not a government or a policy incentive, there is some incentive for those owners to sell. Like, that is some level of mitigation. I know, I think in Houston and in New Jersey, there's a home buyout program where qualifying residents within flood zones can get their property assessed, sell it to the city, and use that money to kind of move elsewhere. And the city will be responsible for demolishing and kind of returning that property to nature in order to help that whole area kind of mitigate sea level rise or extreme weather or things like that. So there are incentives out there that are starting to pop up where individual owners or private citizens can use these mechanisms to mitigate their own situation.
That's interesting. So the city is not looking for it. They're not going to reuse the land. They're basically saying this is worth it for us to buy it back and just prevent anybody else from living there.
Yeah, I think, whenever disaster strikes, right, like it's going to be a strain on the city's services in order to, for lack of a better term, like bail people out of these situations. If you're knowingly living in a flood zone and you're at high risk, the city knows they're going to have to spend extra resources on that. So in a way, it kind of makes sense for the city to put these incentives out to help you while they can before disaster strikes. And I think another thing that is interesting is that it is this small way of doing something that potentially prevents a bigger move having to be made, right? Like it would be a lot worse if the city said, hey, like everyone within, this 3 mile radius needs to move and you need to move tomorrow. And there's nothing really we can do. This is all the money we're allotted. So this is all you're going to get.
I think so much of this is getting ahead of the curve, being in front of the eight ball, because you don't know when disaster is going to strike. You don't know when the next big event is going to happen. But that's probably the worst time to think about it, by the way, too. Like it's when you have time, not to say you should take all the time in the world, but you can think much more clearly and much more at a much more level kind of manner than if something just bad happened all of a sudden. And I think those sort of common sense approaches are helpful, but at the end of the day too, it's, that there are going to be some people who refuse to move and there's going to be some people who just are going to be stuck there. So I guess you got to do the best you can.
I was hoping I could get an answer to my question of to buy or not to buy, but I guess it's gonna be difficult.
Well, it depends, right? There is one advantage. So the other night I was talking to a guy who works in insurance, and one of the things he was saying is like, there are places in America now where private insurers won't cover homes, and you're gonna just have to go to the government, and they're gonna need to charge you out the nose because once a storm hits, everybody's gonna be making insurance claims. So you have two options, right? Either suck it up because your mortgage is gonna require you to get insurance, or you can own the home outright and opt not to pay insurance and just take the risk, right? So you could be saving some money there.
All right. I hear a vote not to buy.
It's all risk management at the end of the day, on the individual side, but also on the large societal side. And if you're one who wants to take advantage of people's maybe fear and think that's not as big of a deal, then I think then it's a good opportunity perhaps. But if you agree and you see a similar risk, then maybe it's something to bake into any sort of calculations you're making. It's interesting. I think everybody is doing this right now. Like, what do I anticipate? What am I willing to put up with in the future? What do I want to put on the line, basically? But it's tough.
Yeah. Some large change that we have never experienced in our life will happen within our life, at least. Yeah. I was thinking that it's going to be a war, like a world war, but I guess, this war with water might be replacing that.
You never know.
Yeah,
right? Natural disasters, a lack of resources precipitates a lot of these contentious situations. And I was reading that 2024 is about to be the biggest hurricane season on record. Something like 23 hurricanes with, was it 5 above Category 3? And the previous yearly average is 14 hurricanes with 3 above Category 3. And when we were interviewing Yair, right, like that interview cut short because a storm hit Houston and his power went out, right? So, that's just going to keep happening.
I think it's the new normal, but I also think I really preach in my approach is not to overreact to things. I think you have to take everything seriously. But I also see that there's a lot of messaging, there's a lot of communication, which is basically preying on the instinct of fear and really trying to sensationalize things, which I also think is irresponsible. So I think if you're involved in the built environment, you have to start to work on this stuff right now, but before it's too late. But at the same time, you have to be sort of measured and clear-headed in your approach to these things, because there are people out there who don't trust authority, and they don't trust, I think this is where climate change denial actually really comes into play. Is people don't believe this happens because they don't believe anything anyone in the government says or anything anyone with a PhD says, and that just needs to be taken into account of. So I also I think the design the design professions, but also anybody involved in the built environment, has the ability to also normalize some of these changes. It's getting hotter, it's getting more intense in terms of the weather. We can show that in ways that aren't so blatant necessarily in our work. And we can start to say, what are some common sense, small incremental measures that can be taken in order to change things? So when I look at sort of the world ahead of us, I also see a ton of challenge, but also a lot of opportunity. And I think one of the big opportunities is creating these sort of piecemeal little bits and pieces, little kind of ad hoc approaches to how we can address some of these challenges. Shade.
I think that optimism might be a good note to wrap on, as we have spent, half an hour of doom and gloom on our situation. But, thank you, Minku. Thank you, Alex, for this wonderful conversation around resilience and cities and how we can make better decisions to improve our lives for the oncoming future. And for our listeners, we are hard at work on our season of sustainability. Hopefully people hard at work, working towards this common goal of making our world better, as our world gets hotter and our sea levels get higher. But if you haven't, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.